Welcome to Old Path Ministries. We're in the book of Judges, and we're at chapter 3 as we begin. And what we're going to find after the first few verses here, this is where we finally start to get into, by name, some of the judges. We'll start the first three. We'll get the first three names of the first three judges, and they go in pretty quick succession, and there's still a lot of the book left, so we'll get a lot more detail as we go on. But the first three judges that are mentioned are given to us here. But before we get to that part, it's really, I think, very, very important that we do a little bit of an understanding when it comes to this, what I would call the matter of theology. And when I say theology and doctrine, you've heard me probably say this before, they're words that a lot of times are thrown around as though they're the same thing, but our theology is what we believe about how God does what he does. And then our doctrine usually follows whatever that theology is on a variety of different topics. In this case here, the very fact that they're going to have not only judges, but there's going to be a lot of armed and frankly just gory conflict that's going to take place that we'll be reading about in this book. The theology behind this is that God allows it, though it was never his intention that this would be the case. So without having to go back and look at all of the different examples of it, the easiest way that we could understand it is to take a look at really the very first chapter and even the last chapter of the book of Joshua, because Joshua was told that if they would be responsible in their walking before God in a place of obedience, then none of the nations would be able to stand against them. Now, we know from what we studied through in Joshua, and really even at the beginning here in Judges, some of the people in the nations that were inhabiting the land of Israel before the children of Israel came to take possession of it, some of them were really resistant. We hear that. Some of them were actually fierce as far as their ability to wage war and to go to battle. And all of that is understandable. That's fine. You're going to come up against other armies that are greater than you are. They were even told that. But what they were told overriding all of it was that God said none of them will be able to stand against you. And why would that be? Well, as we saw at Jericho, God would be the one who would do the battle for them, or do the fighting for them in the battle. And if they were to keep their eyes on him and never get to a place of rejection or disobedience, then they would be able to overcome even the most difficult of opponents. So even the ones that did not want to go, they would have been able to ultimately triumph over them if they were to keep their eyes completely on the Lord, not try to take it upon themselves, not settle for what would be the second best. And that is what we see over and over, that they didn't conquer the people, but the people that were not conquered were willing to serve them if they were able to stay. And the corruption was almost immediate. Now, what we're going to see in this chapter, we're only going to get through chapter 3 at this time. I don't really want to rush through this because it's so important at the beginning of going through this to understand what really brought them to this point. So the next generation of people are going to come onto the scene. These are the ones who were not familiar with how God had fought the battles before. So they were going to be a generation that would have to stand on their own. Now, it's an interesting study in human history that we can see over and over again, and especially in nations where God has done something really vital and important. There's none greater, obviously, than the nation of Israel, but even in our own country here, we're still it was such an interesting way that the nation was founded, in that it was founded by men who had a biblical worldview. Some of them were very devout believers, and other ones were kind of all over the place. But nonetheless, our system of government, and especially our laws, were given from a biblical worldview that was Judeo-Christian. So it was a biblical view of law. And with that generation left. And as generations do, the older that a nation becomes, the succeeding generations are going to do one of two things. They're either going to be careful to remember the history and be familiar with it, and then continue on doing as those before them had done, or they're going to rebel against that because they haven't seen it for themselves. Here we are in 2020, and I don't think I've ever seen the nation as disjointed and really adrift when it comes to any kind of compass and mooring of any kind. Certainly not morally, and in so many ways that you could measure this, the country is very much, as I said before, adrift. And it is mainly because we don't understand much of our own history. Well, there's a danger in that because then everything gets rewritten through new eyes and new ideas, and those are not helpful. So again, if what you had at the source was good and solid, then a deviation from it is going to start to reflect itself in the society. This is precisely what happened in Israel. And so the next generation of people had not been in the trenches, if you will, during the war to take the land. And they don't understand that the victories that were gained because God had done such miraculous things through the people in the nation. So the next generation, if they're not familiar with that, and if they don't desire to know the history of where they came from, you would just, even if we weren't even to read the text, let me just throw it out there this way to you. If the people were brought into the land and God was the one who led them in, and it was he who had said, I will make you successful if you keep your eyes on me and are obedient to the things that I instruct you to do. We know that they would be successful. We know that they were. We know when they took their eyes off that they began to fail. And we know that even with Joshua, when he was about to leave this world, he had made this pact with them, if you will, and he actually made a covenant with them, if you will, better, by putting up a stone as a remembrance to them that they said, we're going to follow the Lord. Okay, great. So that generation dies off, and that brings us to where we are here. The next generation disobeyed everything that God had said to do, and they did so because they didn't bother to look back at their history. So they did everything that they could to provoke God, and that's what we're going to see, this repeating cycle, that they're doing fine, they begin to rebel, and then there is the time of just difficulty and conquering of the nation, and then them crying out for some kind of help, God restoring them, and then things just were going in that circle. And so that's what we have here at the beginning, and it shows us right here in this particular chapter as we go in. Now, what I will do is put up a map of the nations that are going to be mentioned here, just so that we get an idea of kind of where they were situated. But we pretty much know, if we think about all the nations that were kind of thinking mostly north of Jerusalem. That's where most of it was. So in the northern half of the country. All right, so chapter 3, as we start there at verse 1, let's have a word of prayer and then we'll take a look. Father, we thank you that we are able to come to your word and we're able to be instructed even in these times, that we can look back at something of a history that is not the time of Moses and not of Joshua, not of the kings, not of the prophets. This odd time of what we call the judges and the way that you dealt with your people. We thank you that it is instructive to us, that we are to keep our eyes upon you, that we are to be obedient to what your word has to say, and that we are not to have the intermingling with the things of this world. You call us to a purity and to a separation. And so, Lord, may we learn that even through this book that oftentimes is ignored and yet is so very important for our understanding as we see how you deal with your people in their obedience and in their disobedience. God, may we learn these lessons. We give you thanks and praise in Jesus' name. All right, so chapter 3 begins this way. It says, now, these are the nations which the Lord left. Now, it says the Lord left them. That's just put here because it says that he's allowed them to stay in place. Now remember, he has said, I want them gone. And the reason he wanted them gone is because he knew that this is exactly what would happen if they were going to remain. And he does an interesting thing here, and we'll get into again. This becomes a big theological question. Listen to what it says. The Lord, now these are the nations which the Lord had left, or left them in place, that he might test Israel by them. And that means that he would put them to the test, or put them through their paces. And that would ultimately be this. If those nations are going to be around them, will they allow themselves to be enticed and led away by those nations? Or will they ultimately finally drive them out when they see that they offer corruption? And then basically, why would God allow them to do this when he knows what the outcome would be? So that when the time comes, that they would not have any excuse is the only answer that you could give biblically to this. So anybody that's going to face the judgment of God, he will allow them to go through, and even in their rejection of him, he doesn't take away the ability for them to reject, because someday they're going to have to answer for that rejection. So he allows this to take place. So he did this that he might test Israel by those nations, that is, all who had not known any of the wars of Canaan. So that's the next generation. That helps us to understand that it is not the parents that save the kids. It is not anything other than this. The parents are supposed to pass along to their children the truth, but the children in that next generation is going to have to stand on its own. If it doesn't care about the history of its own nation, if it doesn't have any familiarity of where they came from, then they're going to be left to their own devices, and they're going to get into the place of rebellion, because I don't care what anybody wants to say. You couldn't convince me otherwise that man is not inherently good. Man is not going to inherently come to look to be pleasing to God. He's going to be looking to please himself. And so they're going to indulge, do whatever it is that they want that makes them happy as they see it, and they will not care to find out what God's opinion on any particular chapter, or any particular topic rather, is. So this is perfect case study in that. This verse 2 says, "This was only so that the generations of children of Israel might be taught to know war, at least those who had not formerly known it." So it was also for a dual purpose, if you will. It was to also make them understanding that the world is really, it's a violent place, and those who would hate them would look to come and make war against them. And so this was to keep them in that place of readiness. So he mentions this, namely, 5 lords of the Philistines, all the Canaanites, the Sidonians, the Hivites, who dwell in Mount Lebanon, and Mount Baal Hermon, to the entrance of Hamath. So most of this is coastal and northern. Obviously, when you hear Sidon and Lebanon and all that, you know it's the north of Israel. Mount Hermon, we know that that's in the north. And then when it starts to talk about the Philistines, we know that that's along the Mediterranean coast, really down all the way to what is known to us as the Gaza Strip. So really, I don't think we need a map for this. We're talking about the northern part of the nation of Israel, and then down along the Mediterranean coast off to the west, not at the heart of Israel towards the east and then to ultimately the Jordan River. It's not that, it's this. Okay? Looking at a map of Israel, these are the areas that we're talking about. So, verse 4, and so they were left that he might test Israel by them, to know whether they would obey the commandments of the Lord, which he had commanded their fathers by the hand of Moses. Now, this is just put in words as though it was a person trying to find out information about the reaction of another person. This is God that we're talking about. He knows what their result is going to be. But it is going to be played out so that once again there's an accountability, that he wouldn't be forcing their hands, but that they would have to stand responsible before him. So it's written in such a way that God's putting it all in place and wondering what's going to happen. Well, of course he already knows what's going to happen. It's just, in the literary sense, it's difficult to try to put this into words other than to say God put the pieces in place and then let it play out. Although he knew the outcome, they would then have to be responsible for the outcome. So, with that being said, we see it verse 5. Thus the children of Israel dwelt among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Now, if you remember, we've looked at that over the last couple of chapters, and it was even into the chapters of Joshua, that the people of the tribes, as they came into the lands, they didn't subdue the land in its entirety by casting out or even by either chasing off or in battle killing off these nations. They allowed a portion of them to sit around and remain as their servants. Well, we know the corruption that's bound to take place from that, and that's going to set the table for the book of Judges. That's going to be the way that it is. So they're going to have this repeating problem. So with that, here's the problem, and this is what was warned against. And they took their daughters, the daughters of these, all the different ites, if we will, okay? So they took their daughters to be their wives, and they gave their daughters to be to their sons, and they served their gods. That's the problem. That was going to be the resulting effect. Everybody could have known it as we started to read this. As soon as we knew that they would start to intermingle with people who were idolatrous, we knew that that would eventually be the end result. Now, again, this is just something that I've seen over and over and over again. When I've counseled people about marriage and whatnot, of course, the only thing I've ever wanted to know is both of them, before we would even start to talk about marriage and go through premarital counseling, I need to know that they're both committed believers. I have had people come to me looking to be married, and one of them is not a committed believer, sometimes not a believer at all. They would be people from time to time that would be less serious, I guess you could say, than the other party, and you knew that was going to be a problem. But the idea that there would be unbelieving people wanting to be married, I don't even recommend it for dating. And here's why. I've heard this as the rationale. Well, I'm a believer, I'm firm in my understanding, they're kind of open to it, so if I could just date them and I'll bring them to the Lord, and this is how it'll all work out. That so seldom happens. Most of the time I find is that the person who was the quote firm believer is shipwrecked, and they end up going the way of the unbelieving person, out of convenience, out of whatever the motivation. But they shouldn't have ever engaged in it in the beginning, because only bad things come from it. Well, again, I'm sure that there are those one-off kind of things that that people may do. In fact, I can even say this: when my now wife of 34 years, almost 34 years, when we first started dating, I was a brand new believer and really hadn't had anybody say anything to me. She became a believer very shortly thereafter. But I do know this: had either one of us been very committed believers and we were around the people that we were in those early years, they would have counseled us against what we did in the beginning. But again, we both came to faith very soon after one another, and the rest is, as they say, history. However, verse 7 says this: So the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. Why? Because they intermarried, which was never supposed to take place. And as a result of that intermarriage, there became an idolatrous generation of people. They weren't familiar with how they got into the land. They weren't familiar with their history. They didn't care that God had told them not to do what they were doing, if they'd ever even been told. They went on with their lives. They did evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God, and they served Baals and Asherahs. Now, these are just the gods of those nations that were already occupying the land where they were when God led them in and said, cast them all out, destroy them absolutely and utterly, don't leave any of them alive and remain, because they will corrupt you. Look at what we're looking at here. Everything that God said would happen happened exactly like it was. So what's the resulting effect of this? Look at this. Therefore, the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of the king of Mesopotamia. The king of Mesopotamia, think about this. This is Babylon. This is Assyria. This is what it was just called before those became the household names. And think about this. This is the same group of people that would be the ones who would, coming from that general area, would be the Assyrians that would, in the northern part of what we would consider Mesopotamia, that would come and wipe out the northern tribes of Israel during, like, say, Isaiah's time, the beginning of Isaiah's time. So the early times of the kings after Jeroboam, they went away into what was not even a captivity. It was just an absorbing of those northern tribes, taken away captive and just intermingled. it was then, after that had become a different coalition of people under King Nebuchadnezzar, later on, a couple hundred years later, they come after the southern tribes, Judah. And that's where the captivity of the Babylonian captivity comes from, of those kings. And so this area of Mesopotamia is just going to be a problem for them throughout all of their history. Really still kind of a problem in today's history. This is we fought wars here and still have military people there. This is modern day Iraq is what we're thinking about. So it says the king of Mesopotamia, that God sold them in, which means he just gave them over. It was like selling a commodity type of a thing. It was that kind of transaction kind of a thing. Here, you can have them. This is it. They were given over to him. And the children of Israel served the king of Mesopotamia, or Mesopotamia, for 8 years. And when the children of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the children of Israel, who delivered them, and Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's youngest brother. Othniel was his name, which means Lion of God. So these guys' names are pretty interesting. So God raises up a person. Here's again the cycle. God says, do this. Man rebels. They fall out of favor with God. God delivers them over to their destruction, or to their, in this case, their defeat and their servitude. They cry out in repentance. God sends them a deliverer, and God gives them victory. Okay? We can just remember that. That's going to be a repeating pattern. It's going to happen over and over and over again. Now, this is, Othniel was the son of Kenaz, Caleb. Yeah, that Caleb, like Caleb and Joshua, the two spies. This was the younger brother's son. Okay, so this would be the guy, Othniel's Othniel is the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel. Now, this is where we get the book of Judges. He was a judge, a deliverer, a person that would be, and there's going to be a whole series of them, because Israel was lacking a central leader like it had had from the time of the Exodus, from Moses to Joshua. There's no Joshua after his death, and they instantly, in a generation's time, find themselves totally in a place of rebellion against God, and now God has judged them. They cry out because they remembered enough. They cry out to God. God sends them to deliver this first man, Othniel, Lion of God. And then it says, so verse, again, 10, Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel, or he was a deliverer, a judge. He went out to war, and the Lord delivered the king of Mesopotamia into his hand, and his hand prevailed over, I guess I should do it, Cushan. I actually practiced this a little bit earlier, and it's a very difficult one. Rishathaim. All right. So the land had rest for 40 years, and then Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. So there's the cycle. He dies. What do we see in verse 12? The children of Israel again did evil in the sight. So as the judge is alive, he keeps them on the straight and narrow. God delivers them through his hand. He gets into his later years. He dies. Verse 12. The whole thing is going to start all over again. Look at what happens here. The children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord strengthened Eglon, king of Moab, against Israel. And why? Because they had done evil in the sight of the Lord. It would be for the same reasons before. The intermarriage, the allowance of idolatry to come in, and their wanton disregard for what really was not only their long history, but even their recent history with Othniel. They have, at this point, it doesn't say how long, but it seems like it didn't take all that long. And so God, it says, he strengthens the hand of this Moabite king. Now remember, when Moses was alive and they were coming up before they went into the land, they had gone to war against Moab. So once again, now they're having to fight battles that they've already fought before. Moab shouldn't have been an issue. It's only an issue because of their disobedience. So God strengthens the hand, and he's going to use Moab to defeat his own people as a judgment. It's an amazing thing, but what's he left to do? So it is God who strengthens the hand of Eglon. And why? Because they did evil in the sight. And so he gathered to himself the people of Ammon and Amalek, and he went out and defeated Israel and took possession of the city of palms. And so exactly where this is, it's disputed and actually very difficult to even say that we can know for sure where it is. We know the name of it, Tamar, but that's there's other cities named that. What we do know is the area where this would have been. So it's, this is obviously king of Moab, so it's still happening around the area of Jericho. And this would have been where kind of they first came in the first place anyway. So the actual location of it is not as important as knowing who the participants are. And now he gathers a coalition of all of these other previously defeated by Israel nations. And they come together. And of course, we already know what the outcome's going to be. God's using these guys that should have never still been around. He's going to use them as a hand of judgment against his people because they have been disobedient and they have done evil in his sight. They've provoked him. Verse 13. So then he gathered himself to with the people of Ammon and Amalek. They went out, defeated Israel, and took the possession of the city of palms. And so the children of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moab, for 18 years. So here they are again in a time of servitude. So what happens? Same repeating cycle. Verse 15, the children of Israel cried out to the Lord, and the Lord raised up a deliverer for them, Ehud, the son of Gera, a Benjamite. Now we know that Othniel would have come from Caleb, and so Judah. And so here, in this case, a Benjamite, or the tribe of Benjamin. And it says a left-handed man. Now, there are some people who will point out that this may be a birth defect. It may be something that's happened, during his lifetime, or it may be that he favored his left hand. There are some who I think read too much into this, and they see it as kind of a backhanded way of mocking the tribe of Benjamin. There's a whole theory behind that. I don't even know why I bother to mention it. There's just nothing that would really indicate one way or another, other than it just says he favored his left hand. Is that because he was naturally left-handed, or is there other reasons? It doesn't really matter. But we do get the detail that it is here. Now, he was left-handed, and by him the children of Israel sent tribute to Eglon, the king of Moab. Now, before we go on, I want to make sure that I double back on this real quick, because it is, again, it's going to simply be something that comes over and over again. This idea of intermarriage and being a part of someone else. Now, this isn't a race matter of intermarriage. The Bible doesn't say anything about that. So the color of someone's skin is of no importance. But these are the children of Israel. They believe in Jehovah God, or Yahweh. This is the one who led them out of Egypt. That is not the history of these other people. They serve other gods. That is the problem of the intermarriage. So it has nothing to do with skin color, or what some people would call race, which in itself is kind of frustrating when I hear it, because there's one race, the human race. The color of melanin, or the amount of melanin in a person's skin, is incidental. They're still part of the human race. And yet we divide over it in our world today. It's such a sad thing to watch. But in this case, it was because of belief and the lack thereof. And that's why God didn't want any intermarriage. Let me make the case from the scripture as far as it pertains to the church and how it's concerned on this, because, again, I know I said some things about dating and marriage and all the rest of it, and it's not something that is of opinion. I want to take you to what the scripture says about it, and you'll find it. Paul addresses this, I think, very well in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. So let's go there. So let's just pick it up at verse 14. Paul says to the church there at Corinth, do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. And here's the question. He asks it in the rhetorical sense. What fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness? What communion has light with darkness? That's the first couple parts there. He's using both extremes. What could this have to do with that? So he puts the Christian as this extreme, the believers in the person of Jesus Christ, the ones who are born again, with the godless who don't care about such things. What do they have in common? And the answer simply is nothing. Or how about light with dark? Now, of course, not skin tone, light as in sunshine versus nighttime when it's pitch black. What do those things have in common? And the obvious answer is nothing. He goes on to say further, what accord or what agreement is there with Jesus and with Belial, just a pagan god, small g? What part has a believer with an unbeliever? And what agreement has the temple of God with idols? For you are the temple of the living God, as God has said, I will dwell in them and walk among them. I will be their God, and they will be my people. There are a number of verses that are here. This is some of Ezekiel, some of Leviticus, Jeremiah, Zechariah, a number of places that are quoted here. And then this second part from Numbers. This is probably more instructive of the children of Israel right here at this particular point, because it's not the time of the prophets yet. We're still talking about just coming out of the captivity from Egypt and into the promised land. When you see this is actually from Numbers, and it says, come away from them and be separate, says the Lord. And so it means that we're supposed to mark off our boundaries. So Paul's using an Old Testament understanding that there was supposed to be separation, just like we see it was supposed to happen here. It didn't, and it had horrible consequence. So Paul is telling the church at Corinth, who is right in the midst of paganism central, says, have nothing to do with that. Don't have any partnership with it whatsoever. It's no different in the New Testament than it was in the Old. Whether we want to see that God said don't do it, here's a prohibition on it, or if we want to study what happens when you do, take your pick. You can either find where God says don't do it, or you can see what happens when they do, and then the problems that come from it. Now, so says that they had put together the tribute, which would have gone to Eglon. So they're the servants now. They're no longer the masters. And what's happening? They have to bring their tribute. Doesn't tell us what it is. We know that there's at least a couple of other people with him to take all this stuff, and it is bringing whatever is required of them, whether it's money or whether it's livestock, whatever it may be, it's being brought. Now, he's going to do something else. So Ehud, and Ehud's name means I will give thanks. So Ehud made for himself a dagger, and it was double-edged and a cubit in length. So depending on the size of a cubit, common, middle-of-the-road answer is 18 inches, so 1.5 feet long. So he made for himself a double-edged dagger, fastened it under his clothes on his right thigh. So he brought the tribute to Eglon, the king of Moab. Interesting if you think about this. If you're going to have something like this that's a weapon, most people, even in our world today, and here's the thought of why it's mentioned. Why does it matter that he's left-handed? And the answer to it may very well be this. You would expect a guy to be armed, but since most are right-handed, and if there's not a sword here, you would not grab it out of your side. They're long. Swords are longer, so you'd want to grab it from this and pull it this way. Well, if he's left-handed, he's putting it to his right thigh, which would make it less conspicuous. Again, speculation, but because we're given this detail, it gives a little bit of credibility that he would have hidden it on his right side since he was left-handed anyway. Left-handed people are not that common, so that's why some figure that that's why we're given that detail. Needless to say, God had delivered this man into the hands of Ehud. Now, we're going to get some interesting, let's just say we'll get some interesting detail before this is out. So he brought the tribute to Eglon, the king of Moab, and we're given this information that Eglon was a very fat man, a very large fat man. And when he had finished presenting the tribute, he sent away the people who carried the tribute. So whoever came with Ehud, they don't want those guys to be ensnared in this, and so he sends them away first. He's going to remain alone. Again, we don't have a lot of detail of how long this all took, but it was enough time for them to get clear of what was happening there. So, when he had finished presenting the tribute, he sent away the people in verse 19, and then verse 18 rather. So in verse 19, but he himself turned back from the stone images that were at Gilgal. So remember, Gilgal was the place when they first came in. that was where they were gathering together under Joshua. By this time, now there's idols in the place. The question is, was that something that was given to them or that they had erected for themselves, the children of Israel? Or was this a way of Eglon saying, it's my territory now and I'm going to set up my idols? Well, he gets as far as that, and he's going to, come back and he's going to have this discussion with the king. But he turned back from the stone images that were at Gilgal, and he said, I have a secret message for you, O king. So the king said, keep silence. And all who attended him went out from him. Odd that he has this reply, but he wants to hear this, and so he sends out the servants, and so it's just Ehud and Eglon. These are the only two guys that are in the room. So Ehud came to him, and now he was sitting upstairs in a cool private chamber, and Ehud said, I have a message from God for you, and so he arose from his seat. So the two men are going to stand and kind of meet together. Interesting that he would be left alone. Kind of an interesting whole scenario, but again, this just is obvious that God is delivering into his hand this king, because now the children of Israel have cried out. God's heard their cry, and he has sent a deliverer, Ehud, and now Eglon is done. God has gotten the attention of his people. They've cried out to him. So this is all something that God is putting together. Now, upper chamber, kind of, his place where he would go to rest. It's away from everything. It says it's a cool place, so if there is any kind of a breeze, it's the place where you would get that. It's up in the upper room part. So Ehud reached with his left hand, took his dagger from his right thigh, and he thrust it into his belly. And even the hilt went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, so that he did not draw the dagger out of his belly. And then his entrails came out. I mean, a lot of detail. Probably detail we didn't need to know. So it doesn't just tell us that he kills him. It has to give us all of this detail. So apparently it was quite a severe thing, because he disembowels him is what ends up happening. It's pretty disgusting. Verse 23, so Ehud went out through the porch, shut the doors of the upper room behind him, and he locked them. So as he gets out, everybody's been sent away. He's able to do what he's done. Now he locks the doors behind him. And as he gets out of their sight, or away from where they could see him, they come back to tend to Eglon. So, verse 24. So, when he had gone out, Eglon's servants came to look, and to their surprise, the doors of the upper room were locked. And so they said, he is probably attending to his needs in his cool chamber. This is so gross, but yeah, they're probably thinking he's using the men's room. This is kind of the thought that's there. So there's a lot of speculation as to why they would have come to that conclusion. I'm going to spare you the speculation. Let's just suffice to say, they came back, make sure everything's okay, doors are locked. They're assuming that he's doing something else. So verse 25, so they waited until they were embarrassed, and they still he had not opened the doors of the upper room. So they're standing there for so long, it gets to be a little awkward, and they realize we need to go check in on this. And so therefore, they took the key, they opened them, and there was their master fallen dead upon the floor. Now, we don't get a lot of other detail, but Ehud sees this as God has delivered them into our hands. It's over. Now you see what he does at this point. But Ehud had escaped while they delayed, and he passed beyond the stone images, and then he escaped to Sarai. And it happened when he arrived that he blew the trumpet in the mountains of Ephraim, and the children of Israel went down with him from the mountains, and he led them. So the trumpet would be the gathering together of the people for battle. So there's enough of them there where they're clearly able to go back, and they're going to make war. He sees this as God's delivered Eglon into my hands. He's gone. The king's dead. Now we're going to go back and let's finish doing this. Let's finish the job. So he said to them, verse 28, follow me. Why? Why would he say follow me, and why would they listen? Now again, we get the impression that they have quit listening, but it's not as though they've quit listening entirely, because if he had said the Lord's delivered them into my hand, if there was no knowledge whatsoever, they wouldn't have the slightest idea what that means. What they have done is gotten to the place of ignoring what God said, and they just had cursory knowledge. God says that, God's delivered him into my hands. That's enough for them to at least get the context of the whole thing. But I believe, making an application, I think this is much of the church. Much of the church would identify itself as Christian, but don't have even the most basic operational knowledge of what it is to be a believer. Well, this is seemingly a very similar kind of a thing here. He's able to say, follow me, for the Lord has delivered your enemies, the Moabites, into your hands. And so they went down after him, seized the fords of the Jordan leading to Moab. Now, the fords would just be passages, whatever it would be, little ravines, whether they were big or wide or whatever else, but it would be the way that people would be able to go to and from down to the water, and it would be the passageways getting back and forth to Moab. They took those so that anybody coming back and forth would have to come through them. So they were able to take these. These are choke points. These are very, very important for commerce and for travel. If you control those, you control who comes and goes. So they took control of the fords that are leading to Jordan, from Jordan to Moab, and they did not allow anyone to cross over. And at that time, they killed about 10,000 men of Moab, all stout men of valor, and not a man of them escaped. And so Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest for 80 years, twice as long as the last time. Sad to say, they're going to fall back into the same thing. We're going to read about it. Well, what we have here once again, that repeating pattern. God says, do this. They're obedient for a while. They start to find other things to do. They begin to rebel against him, do all the things that he didn't say, and he's left no option but to let them stand on their own, and they are judged. And they fall into horrible calamity, and they just repeat the cycle. Well, this last part, verse 31, is always comical to me. But we get this. Now, if we look at Othniel and we look at Ehud, again, we've got some details from these guys. Not a whole lot. But look at this guy here. This is the third one. Now, after him was Shamgar, and Shamgar means sword. And it just says this, the son of Anath, who killed 600 men of the Philistines with an ox goad. And he also delivered Israel. Sounds very similar to the kind of stuff that Samson did, though much larger in its number, and it was just with the jawbone of a donkey. But this is just with a goat, and he takes out 600 guys with it, and then we only get one verse about it. He's only mentioned one other time, just in with the other judges. If I'm this guy, I'm thinking, wait a minute. I mean, it's not like what I did was insignificant. I only get one mention in one verse. This is terrible. Well, this is all that we get of the exploits of Shamgar, but I don't want to minimize it too much. But that's a pretty impressive feat. You take out 600 guys with just a goad of, that's the thing that you use to direct your animal where it's supposed to go. So pretty impressive. But he only gets a verse mention here. So kind of, I don't know. You may not find it comical. I certainly do. But what we'll do is we'll get to chapter 4. We get to a very recognizable name of the judges, Deborah. And we'll pick that up next week, and we'll see if we get through into chapter 5. We get the first 5 of the judges given to us. We've seen 3 of them here this time, and between now and about the midway point of chapter 5, we'll hear of the other 2, Deborah being them among them. And we'll pick up there next week. So we'll get all chapter 4 next week. We'll get into chapter 5 probably. And we'll start to make our way through the book. So with that, this is really kind of the changing chapter where we're introduced to the people for which the book is named, the judges. The first couple of chapters is kind of more of a historical rewind of what happened even back to Joshua's day and them coming into the land and some of the battles and some of the nations and how they had, or some of the tribes rather, and where they had settled. Now we're into the reason why the judges were necessary, and we're starting to get some of their names. There will be a total of 12 of them that are men and one woman, Deborah, and we'll be able to take a look at that starting next week. We get into the next group of the judges. So with that, we pick up next week, and I will see you next week. God bless.